Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good morning to everyone. Let me also extend a welcome to the FY13 JMHCP grantees who have joined us here today. And I'm really proud to say that many of them will be serving as faculty for several of our sessions that we're having here today. So it's always great to see a program start out 2 years ago, and now those who have been leading that program are here to share their experiences and their guidance with the rest of us. So we're looking forward to their comments throughout the day. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Laurie Robinson, who is leading our panel on the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing today. And I want to emphasize leader, because Laurie is one of the nation's foremost criminal justice leaders and has been throughout her career. I first saw Laurie's leadership in person many years ago, and I won't say how long ago, but many years ago when we were both part of the National Coalition for Jail Reform. And we would attend the meetings on a monthly basis, and I felt like I knew a little bit about law enforcement, but I didn't know a whole lot about jails or jail reform. And this was a great collection of diverse individuals, and the meetings sometimes became raucous and the ideas would fly around the room, and somewhere at some point in one of those meetings, Laurie would speak up, and she would always take the ideas and coalesce them into the cogent point that the group was trying to get their arms around. And back then, I saw that leadership in action, so it was no surprise to me to see what she has done throughout the rest of her career. Since 2012, Laurie has been the Clarence J. Robinson Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University. She's just finished a very busy year where she has served as the co-chair of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and has graciously offered to provide us some insights into that task force and its recommendations. From 2009 to 2012, Laurie served as the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs in the U.S. Department of Justice. And I might note that this was the second time that Laurie held this position. From 1993 to 2000, she held the position of Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs in the Clinton administration. From 2003 to 2009, Laurie was the director of the Master of Science program in Criminology at the University of Pennsylvania. And her list of accomplishments go on, but I will stop there lest we all get an inferiority complex. So I'm very happy and honored to introduce Laurie J. Robinson.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Jerry. He's giving me a booster stand. I feel like I'm a little bit too tall. Jerry, I'm not sure I need that, but thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not used to being tall, so I'll just stick with this. Thanks anyway, Jerry. But I am really delighted to be here this morning on what's obviously a very important topic. When I was at the Justice Department, I had the occasion over those years to work very closely with the Council of State Governments, with Mike Lawler, with Mike Thompson, and a lot of others. So it's a real pleasure to be back today, and particularly because these issues of criminal justice and mental health were very much front and center for the President's Task Force on Policing as we were putting together our agenda just about a year ago, and certainly as we were jumping into the work last winter and spring. The purpose of our plenary this morning, as Jerry said, is to talk about the report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and specifically its recommendations relating to law enforcement's response, a hopefully collaborative response to individuals with mental disorders, and then explore steps that communities can take to implement those provisions in their jurisdictions. In fact, the task force recognized that law enforcement increasingly, of course, has been called upon in recent years to respond to individuals in the community with mental disorders. And yet, too often, police, as you well know, have not been given the tools and the training to effectively deal with them, as our last panel discussed. But happily, leaders in law enforcement and in behavioral health, and that includes so many of you who are here today, have worked hard to reverse that trend. And it's really because of your work that the White House Task Force was able to turn to best practices to develop recommendations for more criminal justice behavioral health collaborations, and recommendations for expansion of CIT training, and for a preference for seeking least harm resolutions, including diversion for minor cases, and for a much greater emphasis on de-escalation training for officers, and the other kinds of best practice approaches that so many of you and your colleagues in the field have helped to pioneer in communities across this country. Because while, of course, there are many, many problems, there also certainly is so much good work that is underway. And I think what we now need to be figuring out is how we spread that good work further across the country. We have an excellent panel here this morning to discuss that very point. And so I want to turn now to introducing them to you. And I want to note at the outset, by the way, that we were supposed to have with us this morning Montgomery County, Maryland Police Chief Tom Manger, who's president of the Major City Chiefs Association. But unfortunately, he had to cancel out for really the worst of reasons. One of his young officers was killed last week by a drunk driver, and very sadly, the funeral was this morning. He very much had hoped to be here, but of course was not able to join us. But with us this morning instead, representing law enforcement, is a wonderful representative and a highly experienced officer, Captain Patrick Kenny of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office in Florida, who is a 35-year law enforcement veteran. And while the sign says William Kenny, he goes by Patrick. So I'm not misreading his sign. I want you to know that. He's a commander of the Behavioral Sciences Division in that office, which is a multidisciplinary unit of deputies, therapists, and social workers who intervene with the high-risk mentally ill. And he also oversees the CIT program, which has trained over 2,000 officers, which is very, very impressive. Captain Kenny is also an adjunct professor of social work at several universities and a licensed clinical social worker. Our next panelist is Julie Solomon, and I'm delighted that she can join us as well because she brings enormous expertise in the area of behavioral health and the nexus with law enforcement. She's currently Vice President and Chief Strategic Management Officer with Wyandotte Incorporated in Wyandotte County, which is Kansas City, Kansas. And in that capacity, she helps to promote sequential intercept initiatives among law enforcement and behavioral health stakeholders in her community. Before going to Wyandotte, she served as Assistant Director of Field Education with the University of Kansas School of Social Work. And she also did extensive work with children and families in foster care and community mental health center systems in both Kansas and in Missouri. Our final panelist down at the end is Deborah Spence, who's Assistant Director of the Justice Department's COPS Office for Partnerships and Technical Assistance. Deborah manages a division that's responsible for COPS training and partnership development, both for government and non-governmental organizations, and she formerly headed the office's Research and Development Division. Now, I got to know Deborah very well last winter and spring because she was the project manager for the policing task force. Now, that title doesn't really capture what it is Deborah did, along with a number of other things. She was with us long days and nights as we were actually trying to craft the language for the report. So we would be sitting around a table, grappling with language, again, long into the night, and Deborah would be at the computer as we were hashing out language, and with technology that I don't understand, it would be projected up on the screen, and as we were arguing and haggling, she would actually craft some language that would pull it together, and Jerry's comment about the jail coalition, she would come up with the language that somehow pulled our thoughts together. And actually, you probably know the language in the report better than anyone on the planet. So wonderful job that you did. We want to turn now to the task force report and its recommendations relating to criminal justice mental health. But before turning to those themes, I thought it would be helpful to say a few words about the task force process and mission, and to give it some context. The 11 members that the President appointed last December were a very diverse group. We had police leaders, a police union representative, we had civil rights attorneys, youth activists, and academics. So it was a very mixed, diverse group. And our mission, as the President described it to my co-chair, Police Commissioner from Philadelphia, Chuck Ramsey, and me in the Oval Office last December, was not to delve into the specifics from Ferguson or any other single incident, but to look for best practices on building bridges of trust between communities and law enforcement, while at the same time promoting effective crime reduction. So it wasn't to abandon the core mission of law enforcement, but to do that while at the same time building those bridges of trust. We organized the report around 6 pillars: community trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, training and education, and officer safety and wellness. And we held 6 hearings in DC, Cincinnati, and Phoenix to hear testimony on each of those pillars, plus a final hearing in DC on futures issues. At those hearings, we heard from over 120 witnesses, including community and civil rights leaders, police chiefs and line officers, experts in technology, psychology, law and criminology, elected officials, and a great panel of young people. The task force then worked through subcommittees to develop recommendations, and then as a group overall deliberated. And I should note that despite our very diverse makeup, we were able to come to consensus on every topic that we addressed, though sometimes with those long sessions into the night. We only had 2 months, in essence, to pull this together because the President gave us a very short deadline to come up with an interim report. But we filed that on March 2nd with 59 recommendations, gave that to the White House, and spent well over an hour with the President in the Roosevelt Room on Monday, March 2nd, going over the proposals with him. He'd had the draft for about 24 hours. And interestingly, he had read the entire report, which was over 100 pages, and spent that time with us. I felt like I was in a graduate seminar because he was cross-examining us about our recommendations and grilling us on why we'd recommended this, what could we do to implement this, how were we going to defend that. It was very interesting. And quite an illuminating experience to sit around the table having him go through it. He had read every line, I think, in that report. The final report came out May 18th. Few changes from the interim version. The focus is now on implementation. It's interesting to me how much attention the report has garnered within the law enforcement profession around the country. The IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, at the meeting in Chicago just in late October, so much attention to the report. Interesting to me how many chiefs around the country, in essence, are using the recommendations as kind of an inventory to see how their departments are doing, going through to see how their own policies, procedures, and training stack up against those 59 recommendations. IACP has set up a new institute to provide technical assistance to departments, primarily small and rural departments, for help in implementing the recommendations. Another example, Massachusetts Association of Police Chiefs requiring every officer in the state to be trained this year on the use of force and procedural justice recommendations. The FBI is revising its Quantico State and Local Academy training curriculum to reflect recommendations made in the report. So those are just a few examples of some of the work being done on implementation. And before turning to our subject, I wanted to ask Deborah if she can briefly talk about what the Justice Department COPS office is doing to support implementation. I think setting up a new division to spearhead this, because I thought you all would be interested in knowing what the Department of Justice is doing to support this work.
One of the things that we're continuing to do is amplify and promote both the task force report and an implementation guide that we released in October. Both of these documents are available for download or to order off of our website, and it's an obligation of my job that I tell you that is www.cops.usdoj.gov. And then, as Laurie mentioned, just the beginning of this month, we launched a new police practices and accountability initiative. This is being led by Noble Ray, the former chief of Madison, Wisconsin. And the team working with Chief Ray on this initiative is really aiming to provide technical assistance to agencies, but more so than that, to identify and promote promising and model policies around implementing task force recommendations, and to develop strategies for implementation that the local communities, local level can really take and run with. That it's not just about providing a guide of recommendations, but here's a how-to of how to make them real.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Deborah. Now, I think that Jerry had handed out to each of you a summary of the key task force recommendations relating to criminal justice and behavioral health. So you have that quick summary. But I want to delve in and then turn to the panel on a number of these. The report includes a large number of recommendations about officer training and education. It really lays out an agenda for making some potentially dramatic changes in the training officers receive and how that training is delivered. Some of the specific recommendations include recommendation 5.6, that state posts, which are the state training commissions, should make CIT, crisis intervention training, a part of both basic recruit and in-service officer training. In other words, no longer just for special units. And recommendation 5.8, that posts should provide training for both groups as well on the disease of addiction. And by the way, the CIT training, the task force felt so strongly about this that this was the only area in the entire task force report where we urged Congress to provide funding to ensure that CIT training was available to every officer. We felt very, very strongly about it. So I want to call on each of our panelists, and I want to start with Captain Kenny, with a number of questions for you. First of all, what kind of resistance do you think there will be to this recommendation? And we're going to put Congress aside here. We're not going to ask about the Congress side of this, but looking at the profession. Second, what do you see as the benefits of mental health and de-escalation training? And who do you think needs it? And when officers ideally should be trained? And do you think there should be a different approach for small, mid-sized, and large departments? And then finally, if you can touch on the issue of whether officers should be receiving training on the disease of addiction. I know I've piled on a number of questions there, but Pat, let's start with you.
This is what happens when you volunteer.
That's right, that's right.
As far as agency resistance, I think most law enforcement agencies today recognize that there's a need for law enforcement to be involved in mental health training. I haven't run across any police departments, any police chiefs that disagree with that. The resistance that we have, though, boils down to some basic concepts. One is the fiscal piece of it.
Yep.
Small agencies, which represent a majority of law enforcement agencies in this country, have a difficult time keeping their staffing at a minimum level and be able to respond for calls for service. That means that they don't have the opportunity to send police officers out in training. Even if they have the funds to do it, they don't have the staffing to replace the officers on the street, because CIT is a 40-hour block of training along with many other mandates of training that law enforcement has, such as domestic violence and use of force. So it's adding something on to the pile that departments are already responsible for. So I think that's where the resistance is going to be. It's not that law enforcement police chiefs don't recognize the need, it's just trying to fit it in. Right now there's a big drive, with all the massive shootings, is to get everybody trained in special weapons on active shooter response. And that seems to be the driving force right now, with mental health being a sub part of that. Now you ask a lot of other questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just add from a practical standpoint, I've had the privilege of being involved with our CIT training. We started ours in 2012. We just finished our 9th class. And we started sort of with the Memphis model of volunteer only, and we have now moved, our police chief this year has made it a requirement. And so from a practical standpoint, one of the barriers or challenges of that is that when you move from a training where you have all law enforcement who want to be there versus into a training where you have law enforcement that are being told to be there, it changes the culture of the training. And one of the challenges that we've had is, it takes just a couple of officers with bad attitudes in the training to really kind of change the effectiveness of the full 40-hour week. And so I think that's one of the challenges as we move to that in the implementation stage, is how we navigate that better, of being able to really diminish that that attitude from kind of taking over, because it causes people to not ask as many questions. It causes, some of the side conversations that can occur. And so for us, we just finished our 2nd mandated class, and we're in that conversation right now locally about how we better mitigate that reality of going to a mandated training. And I think the other thing that we're navigating right now is that I absolutely support our chief's mandate to have 100% of officers trained, and many of you all know that it goes against the traditional Memphis recommendations and model, and I think for some very good reasons. I think there's some very good pros and cons as to why why it's volunteer versus the sort of voluntold piece. But one of the logistical issues on the ground is the response time for calls for service. I think it really helps in our community, having everybody trained it's good from a liability standpoint and from a public relations standpoint, in terms of having whoever the first officer responding has that foundational knowledge. But I think the reality is there are, and we all know this in all of our fields, there are certain individuals and personalities who are better suited to respond to these kinds of mental health calls. And so being able to build in the infrastructure of having that right personality be the one that is also en route, even if it's the first call for service time, is whatever officer. So that's one of the things that we're working on right now, is sort of a two-tiered piece, is let's get everybody trained, but then we're in active conversations with our law enforcement community and our police chief about developing a specialized CIT unit in order to have that right personality, those who want to be involved with the mentally ill population to be the ones that are responding to the call. In addition to having everybody trained.
Let me follow up on that, Julie, and just ask you, do you think that it would make sense to adapt the training at all now that it is going to a broader audience?
Say more about that question. Adapting it in what kind of way?
Well, I'm not an expert in the training itself, but I'm just wondering if you're hitting an audience that is not a volunteer audience, would it make sense to think about adapting that training to try to reach people who are not necessarily open to it?
I feel like our training does a pretty good job of, using scenario-based sorts of, tools, as well as just sort of broad range that helps. Every officer, every person has had experiences that can relate to the content that's being delivered. I think what we're kind of building to address those issues is having more presence. Our police chief and our mayor and our sheriff come in at the very beginning of the week, and we also have a state representative that comes in and just really delivers the message from top chain of command that this is why we're moving to this direction, and really hears from the police department level, from the local government level, and from the state level of why this is important. And I think that check from the beginning helps to diminish a little bit of that, but we're also moving to have one of our majors who's involved from our department be there the entire week as just part of that chain of command leverage in the room. But it's really, it's disappointing only in that it's really a very small number of people that can really, critically change the week. And so it's really important as we move to that to address that.
Yeah, the dynamic, Yeah, Deborah, do you want to weigh in here?
I was also thinking that there's a way that we can reach out to officers about why they should want to participate in a training like this, and focus on the way that it can protect both the community and themselves. That knowledge is power in this instance, of that if you're in a situation and you don't know how to handle it, or you aren't really sure that you understand what's going on, that's stressful, and that raises the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake. And once mistakes happen in police-community interactions, things can get dangerous very quickly for everybody involved. So I think there's ways to approach introducing new training in a way that will speak to officers coming at it perhaps skeptically on the way in. And then I also think that it's about making it clear that when we don't understand someone's behavior, we have a tendency to make moral judgments about them, and that's not the role of a police officer in a situation when they're out on the street with a community member. So.
Okay, let me go back to my last question, because I did throw a lot of questions out there. What about the issue of receiving training on the disease of addiction? Is this something that does make sense, Pat?
I think so, but there's got to be a fine line. Police officers need to be informed about a lot of different pieces of information that's important to them making decisions on the betterment of the people they're working with. We just have to be careful that we're not trying to make clinicians and addiction professionals out of police officers. They need to have some of the basic concepts, some basic knowledge, some basic recognition, but we need to be able to figure out where that line in the sand is, that we're not trying to make them a therapist. And that's where I think we're getting a little bit of resistance or pushback from law enforcement, because we're putting a lot of onus on police officers to do more and to make the right decisions all the time. And it's just virtually impossible for them to be a professional at every aspect of mental health, substance abuse, and policing. I'm a police officer, 35 years. I think I now have a handle on it, but it's taken a while. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I'm still learning. So I can't expect police officers to walk up and be experts in mental health after a 40-hour class, especially without practice or recertification, and I can't expect them to be professionals with addictions. But I think we can give them enough cursory information and give them resources in the community. I think is probably the biggest key to success, is giving them resources to the community, be able to recognize what the problem is, and then being able to refer people to the appropriate authority. When I look at like Palm Beach County, we run about 1.2 million service calls a year. And out of that, we run less than 3,000 Baker Act or mental health emergency Baker Act calls where we have to take somebody to a facility. And it sounds statistically like a very low and insignificant number until you look at the jail. And then what you see in the jail is, 60-65% of the people in the jail are in there because they have, maybe a criminal history, but they also have a substance abuse or co-occurring mental health problem. So we do recognize it as a problem, but like I said, if we can teach police officers the basic concepts and draw the line there, but provide them the avenue of resources and referral sources, I think we're going to be ahead of the curve at the end.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. An important task force recommendation, it's recommendation 4.3 in the related action items, states that law enforcement agencies should engage in multidisciplinary community team approaches for planning, implementing, and responding to crisis situations with complex causal factors. So I want to ask Pat and Deborah, are law enforcement agencies across the country receptive to these approaches? Now, I know that the believers in this room are, but what about the rest of the 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies? And if not, now I know you guys haven't polled them, but if not, what do you think the biggest challenges and impediments are to reaching those types of agencies? And then kind of more specifically to planning and implementing these kind of approaches?
Sure. I actually think there's a little bit of the life serial approach here of that, like Mikey, if you try it, you might like it. When we do training in a lot of different arenas at the COPS office, sometimes around multidisciplinary approaches to solving problems, sure, we see occasionally some initial skepticism, but also open-mindedness of, what I'm doing isn't working, and why should I continue to bang my head against the wall? Let's listen to hear what these trainers have to say. We also see that skepticism is pretty quickly overcome. We have extensive training in the area of drug-endangered children, which puts both law enforcement and social workers in the same training room, and normally by the end of the day, they can't believe they weren't working together beforehand. So I think there's an element of just exposure helps overcome skepticism, and then from there, there's a lot of willingness that people get the chance to see that they all really actually want the same end goal, and that they can bring different tools to the project, and that it doesn't need to be a competition between different service providers.
Pat, agree?
Yes, I think when we started our CIT program back in 2000, we, and even up to today, we're met with a lot of skepticism from the police officers who go, and usually they're sent. In the beginning, we tried the volunteer program, and now we try to send as many officers and supervisors as possible. And a lot come in with the arms crossed, sitting in the back of the room. They get there early like they do in church so they can get the good seats in the back. And they sit there stoic, and that first day they hate it. And they're all in their little pods and groups and talking about how miserable life is for them right now. The second day we take them out and take them to some community mental health centers and to the VA. The VA has really been like the turning point for us. The mental health centers have too, but when they get to sit down with some veterans that have PTSD or have some other mental health problems, and they can sit down and talk to them, and they can relate to them some of their experiences that they've had with law enforcement, and the law enforcement officers are kind of shocked And the buy-in comes right then and there. The rest of the week, I'd say 95% of the people, it's 100% buy-in, and they like it. They do the training. We get the feedback. This is the best training I've had. This has been the most interactive training. This is the biggest tool that I can put in my toolbox. So I think there's a big buy-in, but I think part of that buy-in is sitting down and meeting with some of the consumers in the environment that they're at. A lot of police officers never get past the front door or get past the emergency room door at a psychiatric facility, and they never get more than 5 minutes to sit down with one of the consumers and talk to them about their experiences of mental illness. And like I said, to me, that's the big buy-in. When you have to sit down with somebody and look them face to face, and you're not doing your job, you're listening for really the first time beyond the basic criteria for a Baker Act, and now you're talking to them about some of their problems, I think the buy-in comes pretty quickly, and we haven't had too many people say, this isn't for me. I've only had one. Only one person said, this isn't for me, I don't want to do this.
Oh, interesting. But I think your example of the use of the VA, that's fascinating. Now, Julie, what about from the other end? Do you have people from the behavioral health side who say they don't want to work with law enforcement?
Sure. Yeah. Our experience has been, and I think this is not just specific to behavioral health, but it's about getting the right people at the table. From each of the departments, and certainly from the behavioral health side. We, for many years, our community had been operating in silos. None of us were communicating. The jail's doing their thing, the police department's doing their thing, behavioral health's doing our thing, and no one's communicating. And so when we started these initiatives locally, it became clear very quickly that, we're all working with the same people, and none of us are being effective. And so the partnerships over the last just 4 years has dramatically changed how we're doing business. And being able to, sort of find that win-win within all of our departments. So, let's talk about those high volume calls for service folks. In most of the cases, we're serving those same people. So the repeat 911 callers that you guys are sick of on the street, we are working with them, and we're not having the effectiveness in the field. And then the jail, they've been repeat bookings in the jail. So how can we all communicate together? And really, from our perspective, we have found that just getting the right people at the table who are willing to listen to one another, sort of put our siloed energy apart and learn from, how can we all help each other? And that's been really a powerful journey in our community. And, and I've said earlier at another presentation that, when you have the resistant people who, in the behavioral health world, a lot of time it's, well, we can't share confidential information with law enforcement, or, it's the whole HIPAA barrier. And it's really about, first of all, educating what we can share in those situations. And when law enforcement's on scene or when someone's in the jail, we absolutely can share information that's relevant to resolving that crisis without any kind of a release. And it's about educating that to our behavioral health partners, and then, sort of doing the workaround if it's someone who's just not going to be on board, and finding the people who are. And for us, that's been effective.
Mm-hmm. So Julie, if a community wanted to go about the process of starting a program like this, what are the kind of the key policies and budget decisions that they would have to make initially?
Yeah, from our community, the data has driven our decisions. When we started prior to 2012, our community essentially had nothing in the intersection of the criminal justice and behavioral health initiatives. And we started very small. We hired a person from our organization who was housed inside the jail, and his job was to cross-check the daily booking report with our mental health system database. And so just from that one step, we were able to identify how many of our active clients are being booked into the jail, what crimes are they committing, what number of days are they staying in the jail, and then from a budget decision in our community, it's $92 a day. So X number of days from our active clients is equating to this amount a month, and in our community, it's about $30,000. We have about 65 active clients each month who are booked into the jail, and what we've been able to do to drive that, sort of program expansion is to say 90% of our clients that are being booked into the jail are being booked in on low-level city crimes. Trespassing, urination in public, we have this whole printout of what those crimes are. And we were fortunate, we were able to use the Blue Horse system that our jail uses, so we have access to their system to flag our clients in their system, and then they spit out the report for us. So we have transparency issues between both of them, and it was really from that we said, okay, here's the data. Sheriff, police chief, our CEO, what are our next steps? And from there, we hired a police co-responder, so we have someone now housed inside our police department, and that was initially funded through the BJA grant. But we used that initial data, and so my recommendation just from on the ground is to start somewhere. If you have nothing, just start somewhere. And then those, I kind of equate it to an archaeological dig. You do one thing and it kind of dusts off and discovers what the next step is for you, and you take that step, and then the next thing will become, you don't have to have some big master plan. Just start somewhere, and it will begin to evolve.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really terrific. Now, the task force also encourages thinking about regionalization, about the notion of shared services or even consolidation, when it can serve as an opportunity for law enforcement agencies to provide services that they otherwise wouldn't have the capacity to do. Because we know that many departments simply don't have that capacity or ability in the way of personnel or resources to develop specialized police responses to those with mental illness. So I want to ask our panel if they can talk briefly about any examples they know about of how smaller agencies can work with each other, or perhaps how a smaller agency can get assistance from a larger department to provide service in this way. Any thoughts?
I can't think of a specific example, but I think there are parallel examples in the other types of specialized police response. And I think a lot of people, when they think of contracts for services in law enforcement, think that means giving up their local police department if they're small. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can contract for simply specific services, whether that's water response or SWAT, or in this case, CIT. That there are ways to negotiate agreements across agencies through MOUs and contracts to get the expertise that you need. So I don't know if Patrick knows any specifics.
No, I agree with you. Let's look at our best case model first with an agency. Wouldn't it be great to be able to have social workers and police officers or therapists working together as a team to be able to address some of the higher risk mentally ill calls or some of our nuisance mentally ill calls, or to work with the courts on developing decriminalizing some of the nuisance charges, or having some type of mental health court. That would be the model that we'd all like to strive for. And that's only going to be I believe, more so in some of our larger agencies where there's more funding available, and that's where the bottom line comes down to it. For smaller agencies, which represents a majority of law enforcement, having a specialized person working inside of an agency, a police officer that handles just mental health calls only, I don't believe that's going to happen. I don't think that's possible, because smaller agencies, usually officers have multiple roles. They may be the guy that gets the cars, orders the equipment for the cars, and he also does the patrol, and he also is on the honor guard, and he's also on the dive team. So I don't think you're going to be able to get anything from a smaller department where you're going to have somebody dedicated. So that means you're going to have to bring in something from the outside that can work in that regional area, maybe representing 2 or 3 or 4 departments. And I really think, and I'm being biased because I am a social worker, but I really think having a social worker based inside of a police department is your best chance at having some success, because they're attainable, they're reachable, that you can see them, you talk to them every day, they can come to lineups, they can talk, the officers can sit there and talk to the social worker about what is going on in the community. The people, the consumers that we deal with don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. So having that social worker, especially in a small community that might represent 4 or 5 agencies, small agencies, he or she may be very familiar with the individual or with the services that are available. So instead of creating, multiple levels of, this agency has theirs and another, I think really probably the easiest starting place is to be able to put a social worker inside that police department where they are there practically every day. I think the funding would go a lot farther that way than any other options that are available.
Mm-hmm.
I would just offer, in our community, on a practical standpoint, we're different from a number of different communities, but our CIT program is actually driven through our behavioral health side. That's different from a lot of communities, but we have 6 police departments in our community. One by far is the largest, the predominant police department. But one of the things that we've done to help sort of meet that need of our 5 smaller departments is that we've hosted our CIT training in a neutral environment. It's not been at our largest PD. We've hosted it at our community college tech center. They have a large conference room that's suitable to that. And so we've brought in, the majority of the classes from KCKPD, our largest police department, but we reserve 2 spots for each of the other departments, which is about the maximum number they can send to be away for 40 hours. And so for us, we've looked at our model more as a community CIT program and not a specific KCKPD program. And while we have CIT liaisons we have 2 within KCKPD, and we have a designated person within the smaller departments as well. That has worked for our community in terms of not having the sort of, political piece of KCKPD's running it. And so for us, we've had active participation from each. Our co-responder is housed inside KCKPD, which is our largest department, but she is able to respond county-wide. So she's been a resource to the other departments as well. And then the other piece that we've done is in our community, when we started CIT, we did not have a 24/7 crisis center, and that was a huge barrier in our community. You're training all these officers and they don't have anywhere to take people except Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, which is how we started. I could speak for a whole nother hour on the drama with that. But we now do have a 24/7 crisis center, and it is open to the whole county. So it really, our training has focused on the resource for all of the PDs in the county. And for us, that's been effective.
Great. Well, we know that these criminal justice mental health collaborations are terrific, but I guess if we could wave a wand, maybe the best thing would be a system-wide approach. And if we could involve additional criminal justice agencies, the jail, prosecutors, courts, probation, and other medical and support services like hospitals and housing, that would be our ideal, right? So I want to ask the panelists, Julie, I want to start with you. If you can think about and describe some specific examples of how these system-wide approaches can be developed, and if you know some examples of those.
Sure. One of the most significant turning points for us was our police department did not have a general order that supported CIT when we started our collaborative training. And so at the time, our police chief, Chief Ellen Hansen, she's a rock star, and I just have to put that out there, she invited us to the table to help the PD draft that CIT general order. And so just from a practical standpoint, again, being able to sort of co-write between law enforcement and behavioral health what that general order was going to look like was was a game changer for our community. I mean, as I said earlier, we had been operating in silos for so long that was just really, just a concrete way of demonstrating the importance of us doing this together. So that's one specific piece. We make an effort to have our jail administrator, our sheriff, the PD, police chief, Judge Lynch, our care and treatment docket judge, and myself are our key stakeholders who are at the table with each of our initiatives. And being able to share with one another transparency, I think that's the other piece. We all screw up, we all make mistakes, and being able to come to the table with trust and confidence of saying, I'm not here to point out your error, I'm not here to point out your error, here's where we screwed up, or here's what you experienced that wasn't helpful from my organization. And so how do we bring those together without being judgmental and siloed and say, how can we work together to fix it? And so, for us, that's another system, just more philosophy that has been really helpful to creating the change, is just really dropping that stuff at the table and being there to support one another in how we can correct the things that aren't working well and celebrate the things that are.
Yeah, and I hear you saying that the candor at the table is really important.
Yes.
And too often in bureaucracies, we're not real good at that. But that candor across the silos is really, really critical.
And those colleagues, by the way, made me promise that I would only have 1 cup of coffee this morning, because I'm usually all over the place. So.
Yeah.
Pat?
In Palm Beach County, we have a criminal justice commission that was appointed by the Board of County Commissions. And our criminal justice commission are representatives from the judiciary, from the public defender's office, state attorney's office, the court services, local law enforcement, and the sheriff's office. And we have subcommittees, and we broke out into a mental health subcommittee. And we have a representative from the Board of County Commissions, the chief judge, the public defender, the state attorney, and a law enforcement representative. And then we also have seats at the table for the community mental health people. And what we did was we commissioned a study to say, what are our mental health needs now and what's the projection for the future? And we spent about $45,000 or $50,000 for the study, and nothing came back that was shocking and surprising. But what it did was it gave us a template to sit down and say, what can we do right now with the resources that we have without spending any additional money to address some of the key issues? And it was broken down into the community mental health, the courts, and law enforcement, those 3 pieces. And we went through each one of them and said, what can we do right now to better our services to the people in this community? On the law enforcement side, CIT was a big piece of it. And we were able to check off those boxes because we were already in that area of movement. But what it really did was bring a collaboration between all these agencies and department heads and politicians for us to be able to sit down and have an open dialogue and communicate what the needs are in this community and to get commitments from each one of those people. And I'd have to say that we're probably about 95% committed and maybe about 40%, 35 to 40% completed on the task force or on the study's recommendation. The reason why we're not able to finish the rest of it boils down to dollars. But it does give us a template to sit there and say, if we're spending $8 million a year to house people in a jail, and we can reduce that by 25%, and we can take that $2 million and allocate it into a diversion program or into a mental health court, why can't we do that? Well, we have a sitting county commissioner that's sitting on there that can help foster that. You have a chief judge who's saying, yes, we can put another judge in for a mental health court. We have a sheriff who's saying, I'd love to. I open up some beds, take the money. I want to close the floor in my jail. So like I said, doing something like that I think is a good start. That gets all the players together, and it also develops a relationship with the community mental health providers because they want to get in on the the plan also, so.
Great. I want to turn now to a different focus in the President's Task Force report. A key theme throughout the report is the need to build community trust and legitimacy through fair, impartial, and respectful policing. And toward that end, we call on police agencies to embrace procedural justice as the guiding principle in their interaction with citizens. And in many ways, I consider that the most fundamental principle of the report. These concepts of legitimacy and procedural justice are somewhat new in policing, as you know, and oftentimes, I suspect, aren't well understood. So I want to ask our panelists what they see these terms as meaning in practice and how they relate specifically to police response to persons with mental illness. Deborah,
Sure.
Why don't we start with you?
So there's really decades of research and practice that supports the premise that people are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those who are enforcing it have the legitimate authority to tell them what to do. And that the public really confers legitimacy only on those that they believe are acting in what we call procedurally just ways. And what this really boils down to is that how we are treated matters more than the outcome of that interaction. And I'm sure that you can all think of that not just in terms of, if you've ever been pulled over, but just customer service in any store you deal with. You might not get what you want out of the situation, but if you feel that you were treated respectfully and fairly, you can walk away feeling okay with the outcome. And I think that procedural justice is then divided up into four main pillars to try and explain why that works. And that's that there's a consistency of rule application, that people feel that they have a voice and representation in the process, that there's transparency and openness about how that process works, and that there's impartiality in decision making in the sense that it's clear why a decision is made and how you would get there. And then I think we also talked within the COPS office and a bit with the task force as well about how procedural justice is not just about the external relationship between police officers and the community, but it's also internal to the agency and how agencies treat their own officers. Because how do we expect law enforcement officers to go out and treat the community differently than they feel treated by their own organization? And then I really think that procedural justice does provide clear direction for efforts to improve police response to persons with mental illness. There's even been some research by, I think her name is Amy Watson at the University of Illinois, looking at the value that ensuring fairness and, interestingly, giving voice in de-escalation techniques actually applies to people in mental health crisis.
Julie?
Yeah, I think on the ground, one of the ways that the procedural justice plays out is being able to have our officers utilizing diversion programs and our crisis centers for our individuals who are committing low-level crimes. Obviously those that are committing higher-level crimes need to go to jail, and but for the vast majority of people with mental illness and co-occurring issues, there are other ways that are more effective in terms of diverting into and back into the community-based treatment center. So I agree with what Deborah had spoke to sort of from the policy guideline, but from on the ground, I would say that that's utilizing that piece is important. We discovered early on that when our clients were being booked into the jail, as most everyone knows, there's also a court date that then they have to return to. Most people with mental illness are not going to make it to court for all kinds of reasons that go back to the disease base of mental illness and co-occurring issues. And so what would happen is we found ourselves, as we were cross-checking the booking report, we were in this endless cycle of our client didn't show to court, so they were issued a fine. That fine escalated to the point that now there was a bench warrant issued. Officers would pick the client back up and then book them back into the jail. And so we were in this cycle that was leading nowhere. And so I think the more we can utilize the diversion and crisis center options, the better. The other thing that I would just add is, these recent situations with law enforcement around the country, I think it's allowing such a small number of bad apples to take over the narrative of law enforcement. And, I think, the vast majority of law enforcement are good people who are in the job to help people. And when we allow, and in our community, and I know communities around the country, we have those same very few number of bad apples that are terminated, and our union is successful in bringing them back onto the force. And I think we have got to find a way nationally and locally to address that cycle so that we can take back the narrative of law enforcement doing an outstanding job around the country, protecting and serving as guardians of our community. And so I would just put that out there as well.
Thank you. Pat, did you want to weigh in here?
Sure. In the police academy, new police officers are taught legitimacy, what their role is, what their legal standing is, what they can and can't do. And they apply that to the people that they meet, especially in the beginning years. And most patrol officers are in their beginning years of law enforcement. We don't have a lot of seasoned police officers out there on the road. Usually within 4 or 5 years, police officers are moving on to other units or through the ranks. So we have a lot of young, inexperienced police officers, and they're basing a lot of their discussions and decisions based upon legitimacy of what they can do. When we talk about procedural justice I think is something that's more of a learned behavior. You learn it through experience, through dealing with people, through helping people problem solve, by listening to people. And I think that's what we need to kind of emphasize a little bit more in our training with police officers, especially in the field training phase, and maybe even by the line level supervisors who are out there, to say slow down a little bit and spend a little bit more time and listen to people. And that's going to get you your procedural justice, because people, they'll recognize the legitimacy of the uniform and the authority. But if it's just a Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am, and they walk away feeling that it was a cold conversation and just a report and a case number was issued, even if the police officer can't do anything, but if he spends that 5 minutes with them, he's really established that procedural justice that we're talking about.
Pat, I could not agree with you more. I think just looking at my students and when I teach my undergraduates, I think it may be true of a lot of the millennial generation that people skills tends to get kind of short shrift. So I think it's a broader lesson, in fact. I want to turn to a subject that has been, and Julie touched on this, very much the focus of public and media attention this past year, which is the police shootings of citizens. The Washington Post and The Guardian both did studies that have been published in recent months about the numbers here, because as we know, there's no national government database of police shootings. And the Washington Post study found that 25% of the 912 persons that they had computed who had been shot and killed by police showed signs of mental illness. There was a publication the National Sheriff's Association put out a couple years ago that estimated that half of all lethal encounters with police involve individuals with mental illness. And a publication issued just last week by the Treatment Advocacy Center said in its analysis that people with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by police than others. Our task force felt very strongly in recommendation 2.2.1 that training on use of force should emphasize de-escalation, as well as alternatives to arrest or summons where appropriate, to try to avoid, wherever possible, the situations where these incidents occur. So I want to ask our panelists whether they're surprised by these findings, and if not, what do you think explains them? And do you think if the task force recommendations were implemented that they would help reduce the problem?
I can begin. A trick question.
Didn't mean it that way.
No, I know. Unless you've been in a law enforcement officer-involved shooting, it's really easy to second-guess what somebody did or didn't do at that split second. The people that we encounter, a lot of times we're looking at whether or not they're armed, are they a threat to themselves, are they a threat to us, are they a threat to the public? And all this happens in split seconds. So when you look at the number of shootings, and please don't take this the wrong way, there's not a lot considering the number of encounters, millions and millions of encounters that law enforcement has with people who are armed. We end up shooting some people. And some of the shootings probably could have been handled a little bit better, a little differently. But for the most part, I think law enforcement does a pretty good job at making that life or death decision. Most police officers I've ever run across, actually all the police officers I've ever run across, they're not trigger happy. They're not out there trying to shoot somebody to get a badge. It really does take a mental toll on them and their families and the agency. But with that being said, de-escalation, maybe not rushing in as quickly, are some of the tools that we can use. But don't forget, on the second part of it, we're also training police officers to rush in on an active shooter situation where somebody has a gun. So we're asking them, we want you to de-escalate a situation and slow down, but we want you to get inside and eliminate a threat if it happens to be an active shooter. What if the active shooter is a mentally ill person? Well, a lot of them have been. So should we have de-escalated just because they're So like I said, there's no real defined line in the sand. At the end of the day, what I think we need to do is to say, what additional tools can we give law enforcement to better make the decisions and have other opportunities at their disposal? If all we give people is a hammer as a tool, every problem is going to be a nail. So if we can give them better resources, and some of those resources is the training, giving them more officers on the street. There's a lot of different things that we can do, but I really think that for the most part, I have to defend the profession as you did so well. I think that, we have a lot of good police officers out there and we make a lot of good decisions at the end of the day, and occasionally we do make some bad ones. Unfortunately, it winds up with somebody being dead and it is a headline, but it is a good talking point for us to reevaluate where we're at and what our needs are and what we can do to try to make things better.
Very, very well stated. Thank you.
Yeah. I would follow up to that as well, to just sort of emphasize that the tactics that are trained in CIT, really help to focus on the things that are helpful for people who are in crisis. And people who are experiencing a mental health crisis often need a different approach than traditional police training trains. And so, being able to add that tool to the toolbox of slowing things down, giving greater, space to the situation, using a non-command tone of voice, keeping your hands in front of you and not on a weapon or other things, those sorts of things, being able to turn your radio down, just using less distraction, those things can save lives. And so I think it's critical that we emphasize the importance of that. I think the other piece is that we haven't gotten to, and for any of us in the room, and I have been in a situation where I've had to call law enforcement for a family in crisis due to a severe mental illness. And prior to my involvement with law enforcement, I didn't have an understanding of why law enforcement is trained in the way they are to be able to enter a home and eliminate the threat. And so from a family standpoint, the last thing you want is to call law enforcement. And honestly, if I were in that situation again, I would not want to call law enforcement unless I knew that we had a specialized unit coming who was very well trained in this. Because at the end of the day, we all have brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and sons and daughters that we do not want to bury. And so I think it's critical that we come together and find a way to help meet both needs.
Deborah, do you want to wrap
Sure.
us up?
I was going to use the hammer and nail analogy, actually. But I do think that all the points up here are valid, that really most people go into law enforcement profession because they want to help people. And I think that all of us, particularly particularly those of us on the policy side, have an obligation to ensure that they can do that by having a wide variety of tools and options at their disposal, and also making sure that the sorts of training that we do for different situations isn't about if X, always do Y, but about helping people make better decisions based on the information at hand and being able to customize their response to the scenario they're in. We can't just make everything a rote, simple computer function. So,
Thank you. I am getting the sign from Jerry that our time is up, but I hope you will join me in thanking our terrific panelists.